Back live now to the committee. Treasury Secretary Ray LaHood is testifying.
That we've collected. We want their cooperation as we look in depth at this electronics issue, because we're going to go in the weeds on this. People have asked us to do this. We think it's important that we do it. Some people believe that the electronics are a part of the problem, and it's our responsibility to really check that out. And so we're going to do that. We need their cooperation in that. I don't know that they won't cooperate, and you know, there have been some studies done by some people that they hired, but also by a fellow at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. We want to look at that information. We want to see if they have any information, independent of people that they've hired. So we're going to continue to really look into that aspect of their automobiles.
All right, let me ask you a couple of other things. I seem to have recall that I read that NHTSA has approximately 700 employees. Is that correct?
Yes, round numbers. That's pretty accurate.
There was some mention about some of this occurring, some of the bad things happening on somebody else's watch, but most of those employees are civil service employees, I assume, or in other words, and most of those employees are still there today that were there.
Some of them are, and they're all career people.
Right. And judging from your earlier testimony, you're pretty satisfied with the response that they made at the time, or the investigations that were made at the time, and what's been done since you came on board.
One of the reasons we made this huge request to Toyota is we want to make sure that when our people put eyes on paperwork prior to this, that we had everything. But I'll tell you this, we have some of the most professional career people. They take their jobs very seriously when it comes to safety, because they know what the work they do could save lives and save injuries. But we want to make sure they had all the information.
All right. Let me ask you about one other thing. I've heard on the news, and I don't know what the details are, but there apparently was some braggadocio or or at least happiness by some Toyota engineers or Toyota employees for getting NHTSA to reduce an earlier recall or hold it down to a very small number, and they have claimed that they saved Toyota $100 million or some huge amount of money. Do you know about that?
Well, no, I saw the press reports where Toyota was talking about that, and but I'll tell you this, Mr. Duncan, we're not going to compromise when it comes to safety, not on my watch. We just aren't. We're going to hold Toyota's feet to the fire. We're going to get all this information. We're going to make sure that what we looked at before was correct, and if there's new information, then we'll put it out there. But so, you know, Toyota made some statements about, you know, saving some money, but it was, from my point of view, it will not be at the expense of safety.
And these earlier reports about NHTSA not having electrical engineers or software engineers, you said that was untrue, and you have plenty of electrical and software engineers.
We have electrical engineers. We have over 200 engineers total, about 230, and we have electrical engineers.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Tennessee's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. My colleague, Ms. Norton, raised the issues and began discussing the black box issue at some point. Is it true that NHTSA issued a voluntary standard as it relates to black boxes, asking that they be included, that they be used in cars?
Voluntary to have it, mandatory if you do have it.
Okay.
For reporting.
Okay. In light of what we've learned so far, and perhaps, sir, in light of what we don't know, because you mentioned yourself, you know, we're not sure it's the electronics, or someone's not sure it's electronics. Does it make sense now, given the fact that this information lag is dangerous, that we require it?
That is something we're looking into.
Is it because of cost?
The answer,
is it because
Mr.
it would
Quigley,
take
is
a lag time?
we're going to find out if they should be mandatory or not. We're looking into it.
Okay. Well, back to the issue of electronics then, and whether or not that's an issue. Do you or the folks who work with you, are they aware that the electronics that are used in Toyotas are being, it's the same type of software that's being used in all makes of relatively new cars? And if that's the case, to act proactively, shouldn't we be looking at the sum and substance of that software to see if it could be an issue with all makes as well?
Of course. And
Well,
that's what we're going to do. I said earlier in my testimony and in response to other questions, we are going to do a comprehensive, complete review on the electronics because people think that it's caused some of these accidents. Members of Congress think that. And it's our obligation to check it out. And whether it's in Toyota or any other car.
Well, have we started talking to other makers about their electronics and the issues they may or may not have had?
We're going to do a comprehensive review.
I know what you're going to do, so I'm just asking, have we done that
We're
so
starting
far?
it.
Okay.
Have we done it before?
Right.
Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
We're just starting because of all the complaints that we've heard.
Okay. But we've heard these complaints for how long now?
On the electronics, since really the issue of the floor mat, we really started hearing about the electronics when we identified what we thought the problem was, and then we issued the 3 recalls. And so we've made a decision to look at the electronics now.
Well, what would you suggest your time frame would be to either to get back to us or to the public in terms of your recommendations on the electronics, dealing with other makers, and the issue of whether or not to make the black boxes mandatory?
Well, I'll get back to you. I mean, I don't know how long this is going to take. It's going to be a complete review, and as you've indicated, it shouldn't just be on Toyotas. It should be on other makes of automobiles that use the same kind of electronics. It's going to be a comprehensive study. I'll get back to you for the record on when our results will be available.
Given your answers, what I'll do is I'll close with the following. It seems that we're flying blind. The makers and yourself seem to be saying that we don't know enough. So that information lag would seem to at first beg the question that we have the black boxes in all these new cars, so that we don't have to go back and say what happened. We know as it happens immediately. So I know you want to review it and think about it, but it seems that the key missing ingredient here is what happened and why. And if we had the black boxes, perhaps we'd have a better answer already and we'd be acting quicker to solve these problems. So it just makes sense to me to start moving and making you made it voluntary. Why not make it mandatory now so that we go forward with more information?
I take your point.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois, thank you very much for your comment. Gentleman from Utah, Congressman Chafee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Does the government treat Toyota the same as it does all the other automakers?
In the last 3 years, we've had 23 million recalls. The vast majority have not been Toyota. The answer is absolutely correct, yes.
My understanding is that the GM Cobalt, which I happen to own, I was surprised after learning this information, that in February, NHTSA opened an investigation into the steering mechanism in the GM Cobalt based on 1,157 complaints. My understanding is that based on 84 complaints, the model year 2009 Corollas were also opened up. Two questions. Why did it take NHTSA so long, when we're talking about model year 2005 and 2006 Cobalts, to jump into this fray? And why is there such an apparent discrepancy between the number of Cobalts versus the number of Corollas?
You mean the number of complaints?
Yeah.
We take 30,000 complaints a year. Every one is taken seriously. We look at every one. we review every one, and we make a judgment
But are
call
you aware
about
of the
when to start an
discovery-
investigation.
Why did it take so long?
I'll
More
have
than
to get
1,000 complaints.
Look, I'll have to get back to you. I don't know the specifics on that, but I want you to know this.
Well, one
Safety-
out of every 30 complaints is about this cobalt, according to your stats. So why did it take so long? And
I'll
what
get
is the
back to
current
you for
status?
the record.
What is the current status of this?
It's under investigation.
Do you honestly believe that Toyota is being held to exactly the same standard as General Motors and everybody else?
Absolutely. 100%.
Is there any sort of interaction with the United Auto Workers and any part of this whatsoever?
Absolutely not.
What is the so-called negotiation? I don't understand why a regulatory body involved in the safety and security has to enter into a negotiation with a company. I'm not understanding that term and what that really means.
Well, we want to talk to them. We need to get information from them. We need to talk to them about what our investigation is about, what we're looking at, what kind of information we need in order to do the good investigation that needs to be done.
My understanding is there's a February 5th, 2010 report entitled, quote, Toyota's Sudden Unintended Acceleration report claimed that NHTSA had an incomplete investigative findings are, quote, certainly the result of insufficient resources. Do you believe that it's common for NHTSA to not be able to go as fully into these problems and challenges because of insufficient resources, or is it some other reason?
We have resources. We have, as I said, we have about 125 engineers. We have electrical engineers. I believe we have the resources in the President's budget proposed for 2011. 66 additional slots would come to NHTSA if that budget were approved by Congress.
Well, my understanding is that it's common, standard language for NHTSA to say, quote, in the view of, if a defect petition is denied by NHTSA, to use the language, quote, in view of the need to allocate and prioritize NHTSA's limited resources to best accomplish the agency's safety mission, the petition is denied. Is there a reason that that language is routinely used? I mean, if you're saying that you do have the sufficient resources and you're using this statement on a regular basis, they seem to contradict each other.
You know what? I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't know the reference you're making on that.
There's been some anecdotal allegations, and I don't know if they're true. That's why I'm asking the question. That there seems to be an increase in the number of attorneys that are going into NHTSA and a decrease in the number of engineers. Can you give me a sense of what's really happening in terms of the balance of the employees?
I'll put it on the record. How many attorneys versus how many engineers?
I'm sorry, you don't know the...
I don't know. I want to be accurate because I'm under oath. If you want to know the exact number of lawyers versus the exact number of engineers, I'll put it on the record for you.
That would be great. Are there any other failures that we see within the system, or complaints or concerns by citizens that have been given to NHTSA that are above and beyond the number that we saw with Toyota, that have not gone into this category of being recalled or going into some other?
I would say the one thing which I've already talked about is the electronics, and that's something that, as I said, we're going to review that because people have come to us, both Toyota drivers and owners and members of Congress, who believe that the electronics are a problem, and we're going to look into that.
Do you believe that there's too cozy of a relationship between NHTSA and the industry? And the second part of that question is,
no,
why would
absolutely not.
But why would Toyota go hire former NHTSA employees if not to just engender a more cozy type of relationship?
You'll have to ask the employees. There is not a cozy relationship. In the last 3 years, we've recalled 23 million cars.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. You've been on both sides of these congressional hearings, so you know what it's like. Way back in October 2007, an enterprising TV journalist in Nashville, Tennessee for the NBC affiliate, Jeremy Finley, reported on a story about the Toyota Tacoma, an unfortunate accident in our area, unexplained circumstances. But unlike most reporters, he dug deeper, and he found 20 cases all over America. He went from Phoenix to Boston. He interviewed former NHTSA head Joan Claybrook, who said, quote, "I think that what you've encountered here is a safety defect of significant proportions." He interviewed other experts. In 2008, apparently NHTSA took a quick look, but rapidly closed its investigation, telling folks that, quote, "In view of the need to allocate and prioritize NHTSA's limited resources to best accomplish the agency's safety mission, the petition is denied." So NHTSA didn't say there wasn't a problem. They basically said they had other more important things to look at. Now, we all know that we want to get to the truth here. I would urge you and NHTSA to make sure that you're asking Congress for whatever resources you need, that you're prioritizing appropriately, and if you could give us assurances that you're looking into all models. I know you're a good person. You inherited a lot of responsibilities, but the public is demanding answers.
Can I just read something here, Mr. Cooper?
Sure.
The Tacoma 2005 through 2010 is subject to the pedal entrapment recall announced in October 09. The Tacoma is not subject to the sticky pedal recall because it applies only to vehicles that have a certain pedal manufactured by CTS. And the Tacoma was not subject to the floor mat recall in 07 because the evidence available did not indicate the floor mat was a problem. We have identified 33 relevant complaints, and we are, as I indicated, those model year are under a recall.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know as well as I do that families who own a vehicle may not be expert as to whether it's a pedal entrapment problem or a sticky pedal problem or a floor mat problem. They want on a safe ride for themselves and their families. So we need to be getting about the business of offering safe rides to folks. Another fundamental concern is this. We need a strong safety agency so that they can catch safety problems promptly and save lives. We also need a safety agency that's not captured or beholden to industry, so that it has the credibility that once safety problems have been resolved, that people feel comfortable riding in the vehicles again, because there are a lot of innocent victims both at the front end when lives are lost and at the back end when livelihoods are lost. So I'm hopeful that we can restore NHTSA's credibility, get to the bottom of this rapidly, and start, you know, encouraging commerce again and safe rides all over this country. So I appreciate your service, not only in this body, but in the executive branch. And just make sure you ask us for whatever you need to get the job done.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Congressman Flake.
I thank the chairman. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Good to see you. I just wanted to follow along the lines that Mr. Chaffetz did, talking about whether or not all car companies, domestic and foreign, will be treated equally. And I know you emphatically stated, yes, they are and will be. But he seemed to present some statistics that show that at least, I don't know, a body like this shouldn't just accept an emphatic statement, yes, we will. You ought to look at the statistics of complaints and wonder whether or not that is the case or will be the case. This is likely to cost, this recall, likely to cost Toyota untold billions of dollars. A similar recall of a GM product, for example, would be similar. That cost, because of our investment of taxpayer dollars into this bailout, would reflect on the taxpayers as well. So I don't think it's out of line to question and at least caution that the Department of Transportation and NHTSA be extremely careful in how they accept and deal with complaints that come in to ensure that government isn't taking sides in an area where we have a big investment. And so I was just a little bit disturbed by the just emphatic statement, believe me when I say yes, rather than, well, if there are statistics that may appear to reflect some kind of favoritism, we'll look into that. Do we have a commitment that that is the case and not just saying, yes, we're going to be treated fairly and you should trust us, but we'll look into the statistics on complaints and how they're dealt with by NHTSA.
Well, Mr. Flake, let me just stipulate, when it comes to safety, there'll be no compromises. There'll be no sweetheart deals. There'll be no cozy relationships. You have my commitment on that. Not under my watch. And as I said earlier, if you look at any speech I gave last year, it was on safety.
No, I
Whether it was in planes, trains, or automobiles, it was on safety. That is our obligation to the public.
Right.
And I don't, buy this argument that because, the government owns 60% of GM that we're going to turn a blind eye to that. That is nonsense. We would never do that. It'll never happen under my watch. I guarantee you that.
Right. Well, what
and
I'm
look
saying
at
is,
Mr. Flake, you and I have worked on a lot of issues together.
and I understand your commitment. I'm just wondering, a lot of this was prior to your entrance there. But I guess what I'm looking for is a recognition that, hey, on the outside, one could question whether or not government, the federal government, with a substantial investment of taxpayer dollars into a couple of domestic automakers, might be under a pretty high standard here, and we ought to look at complaints and make sure that we're treating them fairly, rather than just saying, yes, we'll treat them fairly, trust me on it. I trust you. I may not trust everybody that I don't know, that I haven't seen. And it goes a lot further, I think, with a lot of us to hear, yes, that's something we need to guard against. That's something we need to be absolutely sure of. Because I can tell you, in other areas, government does favor areas, individuals and others with whom investments are made. That's just the bottom line. That's how governments work. That's human nature. So I guess what I'm asking for is just a little recognition that that's something that we ought to be concerned about, and we are. So.
I recognize that.
All right, thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
Thank you. Secretary, you earlier did note the investigation of the cobalt that has been opened. In your opening remarks, first set of remarks, you talked about the members of NHTSA who went to Japan and shortcutted an investigation by saving time and money and getting a voluntary cooperation early on based on the end of '09 trip to Tokyo. Is that right?
Yes.
So we own 60% of General Motors. The Cobalt has had far more complaints on a very reminiscently similar problem to where you have a recall on the Corolla. Why aren't we getting that level, or let me rephrase that. Are we doing this investigation in the slow road because General Motors is not what Toyota was willing to do when your people went to them last year?
Well, repeat the question.
Well, wouldn't it save us money if General Motors would do what Toyota did and not make you go through the long investigation process on a car which has had far greater complaints and should be under the same scrutiny?
Our job is to do an investigation. If we can get cooperation, we get it. If we can't, we use every tool in our toolbox to get to the bottom line, which is the safety of these cars.
How about our majority interest in General Motors? We own 60% of them.
Ask me a question about it.
Well, are you willing to ask General Motors to cooperate as fully as Toyota did with the Corolla on a car which has had more complaints for a longer period of time?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you. It's good to see you in this role. And I want to commend you for the stellar job that you've been doing since having been appointed and confirmed. Let me ask you, as you are aware, some believe that the uncontrollable sudden acceleration problems are not being caused by pedal entrapment or sticky pedals, but by an electrical malfunction, either a software problem or electrical interference with some component of Toyota's computer systems. It is my understanding that the Department of Transportation has now launched an investigation into possible electrical interference as a possible cause. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would call it more of a very comprehensive review, and at some point we may get into an investigation, but we're going to do a thorough review and look at everything. And by that I mean we know now, as a result of testimony given yesterday, there's a fellow at Southern Illinois University who did a study. We want to look at that. We want to look at what Toyota's done. We want to look at all the facts and then determine if in fact there is a problem.
Well, can I ask you, what precipitated or caused you to look at this particular area?
Complaints from people that own these cars, and also members of Congress who believe there is an electronics problem.
It is my understanding that both Toyota and NISTA have examined this issue before. What would be different now about the examination?
I think testimony that was given yesterday before the Commerce Committee, where a gentleman from SIU has done a study and he found that there were some problems. We want to look at that. If there's fresh information, if there's new information, we know that Toyota hired some people to do a study. We want to look at that. We want our own engineers to go back to look back. If people think that there's a problem, we should look at that. That's our job, to look at it.
So you're not really relying upon past examinations, past experiences. You're really starting now?
Yeah, we want to put eyes on the fresh information, the new information.
Let me thank you very much. That gives me some assurance that we are going to do a thorough investigation. I commend you again for the work that you've done, and thank you for appearing.
Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukenmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for the frankness of your answers today. Compared to some of the recent witnesses we've had, it's very refreshing. Thank you. I'm kind of curious. I think, to me, the question here is the protocol or process that you have in place with regards to reviewing 30,000 complaints a year, and what raises it to a level that you would start to investigate the floor mat problem, for instance. So can you kind of give me a little overview of your process or your protocols that you have in place with regards to how many complaints do you have to have, how serious do they have to be before they're raised to the level of requesting a recall from the manufacturer, and kind of walk us through that process so we can see how some of this may have...
Well, I mean, there really isn't. I can't give you a number where you say, you know, once you get 25 complaints, that's it. That's the, you know, that's the benchmark. It depends. I mean, the gentleman from Utah was questioning why it took 1,300 one place and a lesser number in another place. And it's the seriousness of the complaint. It's our people who are experts really looking at these, driving the, looking at the research, talking to the people that own the automobile, talking to the car manufacturer, and really trying to discover if there's a serious flaw or defect or something wrong. And
so it's
a judgment call.
It's more individualized based on the particular incident that you're investigating.
That's
right. Is there a certain number
and if there's a commonality, say that, you know, there's 100 complaints and they're all about the same thing, then obviously that's probably an issue that we need to look at.
I know a couple of members were talking about trying to bring into the investigation information from other parts of the world. Have you done that at all with any recent investigations?
We do that. I mean, we try and get information from the foreign car manufacturers in other places in the world. We look at it and see what it says.
I know that you've mentioned that you're going to are looking to try and get some more engineers on your watch here. And one of the things that the folks at Toyota have made a comment about is that they believe, and the comment was, the new team has less understanding of engineering issues and are more focused on primarily legal issues. Do you think that's a fair statement, or is that the necessity for more engineers?
Is the statement that engineers are working on legal issues? Is that what that said?
No, what they're trying to say is that your focus is more on the legal part of it versus the actual engineering part where the problem really is.
I mean, I don't buy that argument, but, you know, if you want me to get you some statistics on it, I can do that for the record. But look,
they're actually making an argument for more engineers for you.
Well, the President put in our budget 66 new positions, and we think that'll be a good resource for us.
And I think, quite frankly, I think a point needs to be made here as well, that a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today with regards to Toyota is their engineering versus the quality of the vehicle itself. I think that, you know, the manufacturing and the quality of the parts on a vehicle are not in question here. It's the engineering of these parts that cause some of the problems to happen. So I guess one more question I have with regards to all of this. When you're starting to investigate, do you bring in outside experts as well to try and work on these issues? In other words, if you have an issue you're not your engineers are not capable
Absolutely.
of doing, or actuarially you're not sure about, well, where do you go to get that information? What experts do you go to?
We go to people on the outside who are expert electrical engineers or mechanical engineers, or we find, look, there are a lot of good people around America who can provide expertise, and we're not bashful about doing that if we don't think we have it in-house.
Do you make recommendations to the manufacturer on how to rectify a situation, or do you leave them up to them to come with?
We leave it up to them, and we don't sign off on it. They come to us and say, oh, well, we think this is the fix, but we don't put our stamp on it, but we make sure that they really believe this is the fix.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate your comments today, and thank you. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Congressman Connolly.
With the consent of the chairman and the committee, I would like to yield my time to Mr. Lynch, who has a pressing engagement, and reclaim my time at the appropriate
Without objection.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman Connolly. I appreciate the courtesy. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you. We have the advantage in Congress of being able to look at things forensically after they happen, and you have the unfortunate disability that you have to make decisions as they occur. And I understand that difficulty. But I do want to say that looking at this forensically, first we had Toyota come out with the recall regarding the floor mats. All right. So I just think that's a red herring, and I'm not sure that all of these problems are from somebody's floor mat. I think it's easily understood. It's somewhat user-controlled. The second excuse was this very simplistic sounding sticky gas pedal, trying to make it sound very innocent. And, now we've got electronic interference, somewhat external, I guess, as the nature of the problem. And it just sounds like the problems are getting, or at least the solutions are getting more complicated as we go forward, more expensive, more pernicious. And I happen to read something by Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, and he's got a bunch of Priuses, but his most recent one is not one of the ones that was subject to the any of the recalls. And he says, I have many models of the Prius that got recalled, but I have a new model that didn't get recalled. And this is a fellow who says a lot of things don't bother him in life except for computers that don't work and don't work right. And he says this new model has an accelerator that goes wild, but only under certain conditions of cruise control, and I can repeat this over and over again safely. He said this is software. It's not a bad accelerator pedal. It's very scary, but luckily for me, he says, I can hit the brakes. Now, here's my problem, Mr. Secretary. My dealers are working night and day right now, my Toyota dealers, to fix the mats, the floor mats, the sticky pedal. They're going through these fixes. One of my dealers I talked to yesterday doing 175 fixes per day. He's got all his people working. And I appreciate that. There's a real effort. But I'm one of these members of Congress who thinks that this is a software problem. And if we're bringing people in and fixing their sticky pedal or fixing their floor mat and sending them back out on the road with the assurance that their car is fixed, we're sort of creating a moral hazard here, a situation that we're telling people that they have the reassurance now because we have fixed it. But if this is still the problem that you're investigating and beginning to investigate, then we're making the problem more dangerous. And I'm just concerned that that's the phenomenon we've got here, that this is at root a software problem, something much more complex, something much more pernicious, something tougher to get rid of, and we're playing with this by telling people, well, we're going to change your floor mat, or we're going to oil your sticky pedal here, and you'll be okay. So how do we get at that?
Well, as you can imagine, Mr. Lynch, I mean, we have to base our judgments on research and on good data and making sure we know what we're talking about. When we say something, people listen to us.
Hopefully.
And until we do the complete review, the comprehensive review, look at all these things, we're not about to say something where it's just not accurate, you know, just for the point of...
Well, you might be doing that already is what I'm getting at. If you're telling people it's a problem with the floor mat, and it's not, or you're telling people it's a sticky pedal, and it's not...
Look, I don't agree with you. I mean, we wouldn't have told people to change out these floor mats if we didn't think our research showed that was a problem. We can prove that. We can prove the sticky pedal was a problem. We can prove it. Now, so to say that that's not accurate it belies all of the facts that we have, and we wouldn't be saying these things if it weren't true.
Well, I just think that we have to consider the fact that there very well could be a serious software problem here, and again, I think we're in a very awkward position if we're telling people that changing out your floor mat's going to fix this, or the sticky pedal solution is going to fix this, and yet we're sending people out in dangerous automobiles. I'm just saying you've got to weigh that in with the course of your investigation and the urgency with which you're investigating these more complicated or complex problems.
I take your point.
I yield back. Thank you.
Right. Gentleman's time has expired. And I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
Mr. Secretary, welcome. It's always my hope that congressional hearings have some sort of constructive outcome, and in that regard, it was discussed earlier, I believe, by Mr. Issa, that a more transparent international marketplace for safety data sharing would be appropriate. In that regard as well, given that today's hearing is about Toyota safety problems, and particularly this unintended acceleration problem, which you've committed to continuing to research and work through, this has happened, though, across other car manufacturers, 2 other car manufacturers from the data that I see. Has there been any discussion about developing some type of consortium, and perhaps in partnership with NHTSA, that would actually work toward a comprehensive evaluation of this so that there could be even broader safety outcomes for the public?
Well, we try and do these things, you know, based on the complaints that we hear from people. We do these, conduct these investigations.
This gets out of our boxes, though. This is a policy consideration.
Pardon me?
This is a policy consideration.
Yeah, well,
potential change in policy.
I'll be willing to look at it, but I mean, it doesn't fit into the what we're doing now.
Should it?
I think it's something we can look at. Look, I get lots of good ideas from coming to these hearings, and it's something that, you know, I'd be happy to visit with you about and see. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's something we're going to do, because I don't know enough about what you're trying to purport here, but I'm willing to talk to you about it.
Again, what I said at the beginning, looking for constructive outcomes. That's
Absolutely.
the purity of my intention, is to maybe think creatively about this, because right now our attention has shifted to Toyota and appropriately trying to get to the bottom of these public safety issues. But again, given that this has happened across the industry, is there an opportunity here to think more creatively, policy-wise, about a common fix using the resources that we have, that, or creating some type of consortium, again, that could look at this in partnership with the government to, again, improve or make the safety outcomes of this hearing and what you're doing even
Sure.
broader applicably. That's just the policy idea I put in front of you.
I got you.
Okay. That's all I had. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield the additional time that I have to Mr. Issa.
You know, I'll be quick, and then Mr. Burton would like to ask a quick question. Mr. Secretary, you said that it depends on, when you evaluate something, how significant it is. But under the current system, the manufacturer doesn't give you every single complaint that occurs, so you are evaluating some and missing others. If there's a sticky pedal like this one in Great Britain, and there's some reports, unless there's a recall, you don't see it at all. Do you think that should change?
Well, look, when we go to the manufacturer and we ask them for information about complaints they've had about their their vehicles. We hope they're going to be forthright with us. I mean, part of the process...
No, I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, but the current law, they only have to tell you if there's a recall. Do you believe that it should change to where all information on like models worldwide
I think the more information, the better.
Okay, do you have the authority to ask for that and receive it from the manufacturers, or do you need authority from Congress?
We ask the manufacturers when we get complaints about certain mechanical aspects, and we assume they're being forthright with us.
Thank you. Mr. Fortenberry.
Mr. Fortenberry controls it. Right on.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remaining time to Mr. Burton.
Let me just, Mr. Secretary, this floor mechanism was made in Japan, and there hasn't been any problem with it. And this one was made in the United States. They both work on the same car. And this one is the one that they've had all the problems with. And they had to put a shim in so that there was proper clearance, so it wouldn't stick. And my question is, why is it in the same car you have two different mechanisms and one's causing the problem and one isn't? It seems to me that Toyota evidently knew that there was a problem maybe with one and not the other, and this one was used in Japan and Europe, and this one was used in the United States, and this is the one that's caused the problem. And he just asked you a question about whether you have the authority. It seems if there's a problem any place in the world, your agency ought to be able to get that information or demand that information so that you can look at a recall here in the United States, even if it happened over in Europe someplace. And I'd like for you maybe to ask, and I'm going to ask the president of Toyota about this today, why there has this difference. So,
would the gentleman yield?
It's his time.
Mr. Fortenberry controls the time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield the remaining time, Mr. Souder.
Actually, the time has expired.
Thank you.
There needs to be a fact.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Point of order. The gentleman made a somewhat factual misstatement about a manufacturer in Indiana, and I think it's important to clarify the record because we went through this once earlier. The sticky pedal, which you said correctly, the one that had a slow return. But the Secretary testified that the slow return didn't have any of the deaths with it. It was the Japanese part that had the deaths. They did have to put that thing in, but there are two distinct things that happened with that pedal. And it's important that the records show that the American part, as we already established, did not cause the deaths.
Let the gentleman know that Mr. Toyota will be testifying later on, so I think that's an appropriate question that could be raised with him. Now we recognize the gentleman from Texas, Congressman Cuellar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, it's good seeing you again. I think last time we saw each other was in San Antonio. It's a pleasure. I have an overhead that I would ask the staff to put on, and I'm going to ask your thoughts on this particular. It has to do with the percentage of vehicles affected by safety recalls from 2001 to 2010. And I would ask you to take a look at that, Mr. Secretary, and just give me your thoughts on that once they make it big enough so you can go ahead and look at that. Mr. Secretary, and I guess what I'm looking at, I do have around my area, I do have the San Antonio plant there where 2,600 employees depend on the work that you do as the enforcement and regulator, and of course what Toyota is going to do. That doesn't even include the on-site suppliers where you add another amount and it adds about 5,500 local jobs in our area. It doesn't include the dealers, doesn't include that. So there's a lot of folks that are depending on what we're doing, what you all are doing, and of course, jobs, and of course, making sure that the drivers are safe. And if you can look at that, I think you see Toyota, if you can read that, Mr. Secretary, about 11%. And my question is, and I know you just got in about a little bit over a year ago, but from your understanding over the past decade, what are we doing to respond to the recalls of other car makers in this particular graph? I mean, anything different that we're doing now?
When we believe that there needs to be a recall, we notify the manufacturer, and and then the recall takes place. And as I said, over the last 3 years, 23 million cars have been recalled, and the vast majority of them have not been Toyota. I can't read that chart, Mr. Cuellar, but if you want to...
Well, there's a company at 32%. This is from percentage of vehicles affected by safety recalls from 2001 to 2010, the last 10 years.
Okay.
You have one company, the one at 32%, another company at 17%, another company at 15%, and then you have others, a combination of other companies, and then you have Toyota at 11%. And
Okay.
this is, again, using NHTSA's recall database list from y'all. So
Right.
I say that, members, just so we can look at the overall picture
Right.
of what we're looking at, number one. Number two is I'm looking at your budget, Mr. Secretary, the FY 2011, and you've been a legislator, and I guess I'm asking your thoughts. Anything you think we ought to do on the budget to improve it? I know it's your budget. I think I know what your answer is going to be. And, of course, any legislative responses that we ought to look at. And if you say budget should stay that amount, no legislative changes, then what should we do differently to make sure that we protect our drivers and make sure we provide that safety and that make sure that car companies, in this case Toyota, make sure that they respond as quickly as possible?
Well, I think some of the things that Mr. Issa mentioned as far as information, we may want to work with all of you on our ability to get information worldwide, and you know, we may have some thoughts on that. With respect to our budget, we're grateful to the President for including 66 new positions. We can use those human resources and experts to help us do our work.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this, Mr. Secretary. I understand that NHTSA took a trip to Japan to meet with top officials to press the seriousness of the safety issues. You noted that it was because of that trip that the actions were made because of the recalls. And I guess I have two questions. What measures did you take before NHTSA made the trip to Japan to discuss the seriousness of these issues? Number one, and then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, we had several meetings with North America Toyota, and I want to stipulate that these are very professional, good people who take their jobs very seriously, and we met with them and talked with them several times about the issues that we felt were causing these their vehicles to malfunction.
Mr. Secretary, why travel to Japan? I mean, I know that there's a different hierarchy in the company, I understand that, but talking to Toyota USA, wouldn't that be sufficient, or was there a necessity? Apparently, it looked like there was a necessity to travel to Japan.
Well, I mean, Mr. Lenz, the CEO of Toyota North America, stipulated yesterday at the hearing that he testified at that a lot of decisions are made in Japan. And when we determined that we needed to go to the people who were making the decisions so they understood that these are serious safety concerns and that we were going to take some pretty significant action, we wanted to go to the people that were making the decisions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. I think just three quick questions. Let me go first to this concern I think was raised earlier by my colleague from Utah and our colleagues from Utah and Arizona about this idea of the government majority owner in General Motors and Chrysler, and yet also the regulator of the competitors of those two companies. Are there, or have you, or has NHTSA put any specific safeguards, any specific protocols in place, again, just to ensure impartial treatment when you're evaluating recalls and complaints you receive from any car manufacturer? Do you know of like specific things you've done, specific protocols, specific safeguards that have been enacted?
Have we put any safeguards in our relationship with companies other than Toyota? Is that what you're asking me?
I'm just saying, just this perception that here we have the taxpayers, the majority owner of General Motors and the government, the majority owner of
So
General
you're
Motors
asking
and
me
Chrysler.
just about those two companies then? Any safeguards, GM or Chrysler, right?
Exactly.
We've put no safeguards in. We don't have to. Safety's our #1 priority. When safety's our #1 priority, it's not going to be compromised by any kind of relationship we have with anybody. Never has been, never will be.
Okay, let me ask you along those same lines, in regarding specifically the Toyota recall situation, has anyone from General Motors contacted you about the Toyota recall situation?
You know, I'll have to check, but not that I know of, but I don't, you know, since I'm, you know, I want to be accurate on these things, and I know this information is important to you, and I will personally let you know, but I don't think so.
How about anyone from Chrysler?
Not that I know of.
Anyone from the United Auto Workers?
No, sir.
Has anyone, specifically Ron Bloom or anyone else from the Auto Task Force, contacted you regarding the Toyota recall situation?
No, sir.
Okay, last question then, Mr. Chairman. Earlier you said, Mr. Secretary, every Toyota car listed on the NHTSA recall website is unsafe. Is that statement accurate only about Toyota, or does that mean any car listed from any company on a recall website list?
Any car, any company on our website that's listed for recall should be taken to the dealer so it can be made safe.
Okay. Let me go back one, if I could, Mr. Chairman, one other. Back to any contact. Do you know if anyone I asked you if you'd been contacted. Do you know if anyone from NHTSA has been contacted by General Motors, Chrysler?
You know what? I'll have to get back to you for the record.
Okay.
Yeah. We have lots of employees at NHTSA. There's no way I would know that. But I'll check it out and I'll let you know.
All right. I would yield the remaining time to Mr. Rice.
Mr. Secretary, this is within your scope, even though it clearly is not something that anyone's going to say you could have taken care of immediately. But are you aware of any studies that show us, out of these 23 million recalls during that decade, how many cars got fixed? How many cars had the...
I'll have to put that on the record for you. It was the 23 million is the last 3 years.
Okay.
Not the decade.
Okay. Of these 23 million, if you have or can get or can have a study done to let this committee know, out of 23 million cars that are unsafe, as Ralph Nader said, you know, unsafe at any speed, well, unsafe on the highway, there are 23 million cars. If, let's say, only 20% of them had their recalls applied, I don't think that's going to happen with Toyota, but it may happen with other less publicized recalls, then we have 90% of those 23 million unsafe and on the highway. Would you commit to us to find out how effective recalls are, what percentage actually get applied, and as a result, how many cars are unsafe, in your opinion, my opinion, I suspect the Chairman's opinion, so that we can evaluate whether or not better advertising or better compliance needs to occur?
Of course, we will get you the information, Mr. Issa, but we're a little bit busy right now, too, so I hope you're not going to stipulate we do it within the next 24 or 48 hours.
No, of course not, Mr. Secretary. Although, if you need more resources, just ask.
Our people are very busy, but of course, we will provide you the information.
And, Mr. Chairman, if just one piece of patience. I'm presuming that all it takes to get this information would be to contact the top 11 manufacturers and ask them to provide it, since they have it, and you said they give you what you asked for. With that, I yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Chu.
Secretary LaHood, congratulations on being confirmed as Secretary of Transportation. I have a question about the pattern of behavior at NHTSA that may have occurred before you got there. And it leads some to wonder, NHTSA is supposed to be a watchdog, but has it instead become a lapdog? And in fact, some people believe that NHTSA has become too dependent on the manufacturers that it regulates to cooperate with the agency and volunteer information about what might be going wrong with a particular vehicle. while NHTSA sends letters asking for this information, it rarely uses a subpoena, which would be far superior in that it would require a full and complete response under threat of criminal penalties. Do you believe that NHTSA is aggressive enough in seeking information that it needs to keep the public safe?
I believe that we have been very aggressive, and if we need to use subpoena, we'll use it, but we have lots of enforcement mechanisms, and I would also stipulate, on my watch, we've been a lapdog for nobody. We've been a lapdog for the people who drive cars and want to do them safely. That's who we've been a lapdog for. Safety is our #1 priority. I've been in this job since January 23rd, 2009. I'm not a lapdog for anybody, and none of our employees are either. But we have good enforcement mechanisms, and we use them. And if we can't get the information, we have the opportunity to subpoena.
Well, if I could follow up. According to testimony that's going to be provided later by a former NHTSA administrator, the agency imposed no penalties from 2004 to 2008, and the largest penalty that the agency has ever imposed is $1 million. The TREAD Act of 2000 now authorizes much higher penalties. What would explain the lack of penalties that NHTSA has imposed in the last several years?
I'll have to get back to you for the record on that. That was prior to my stewardship of this agency. But I'll put that on the record for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman, yield back?
Yes, I yield back.
Yeah. I now recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes, Congressman Bill Bray.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, first of all, congratulations. I'm glad to see a fellow classmate serving the nation in a different set, but I can't think of a better choice that the President could have made, and so I'm glad to see you there.
Thank you.
I happen to drive one of these vehicles, hopefully safely, and we'll correct whatever we need to do. But in San Diego, we ended up having this incident where a highway patrolman driving his wife, his child, and his brother-in-law ended up basically dying because of the MAT issue. When I look down at this list, I'm wondering, though, from a observation from a distance, that could have the reputation of Toyota actually been a contributing factor in how this process was handled. Some may not know, but Toyota is ranked at the absolute top, second only maybe to Mercedes and Porsche for satisfaction, for reputation. And I guess if you drive a Porsche, you darn well better be happy with the vehicle if you've paid for it. But is it possible that in this process, the great reputation of dependability and safety that Toyota has created over the last 30 years created an inadvertent prejudice against more strict review, because everybody always assumed in the last 20 years, and let me just stop and say, 10 years from now, 10 years ago, if you and I would have said we would be here talking about Toyota, most of us would have said you're crazy. Hugo, maybe. You might have been talking about General Motors, but we never would have thought it would have been Toyota. Could have that inherent institutional prejudice, and I'm not saying just to the agency, but to society as a whole, could have we created a situation where maybe there wasn't as critical review up front on Toyota that might have been done if it was a Hugo or if it was General Motors?
Well, not in my opinion, Mr. Bill Bray. I've been in this job 13 months. I've worked with the people at NHTSA. They're a lot. Almost all of them are career people. They take their jobs very seriously because it does involve safety, and I don't think that's the case.
Okay, I appreciate that. In 2007, there was an investigation conducted about the MATs. It appeared that investigation, or the outcome of that investigation, didn't reflect what we now believe should have been the proper observation. It wasn't until the deaths in my county and Darrell Issa's county that it really raised the concern last year when we had the crash again with the MATs again showing up. how do we have this investigation 07 review all of these models, pull back on a lot of models, and then still end up with a situation to where by 09 people are dying in the streets of San Diego County?
Well, it's obvious that to us that when that crash occurred, that highlighted again the floor mat problem. That was determined to be what caused the accident, and that was the issue. And we also, looking back, realized that people really weren't taking their cars in that had floor mat problems, and so we re-engaged Toyota to ask for another mailing to their customers so that they could bring them in and have the floor mats replaced. And then that led to the investigation of the sticky pedal and the result of the determination that that needed to be fixed also.
Well, in all fairness, Mr. Secretary, when we talk about the floor mat issue, we're talking about the all-weather mat, and we're talking about, in this case, in San Diego's deaths, it was not an owner who didn't bring it in. This was actually a dealership vehicle that still had the mats in place. And so there seems to be a big disconnect between what we said we wanted done and what was actually down in the field. And I think that, in all fairness, this one shows that it wasn't just the fact that those of us who drive Toyotas didn't take the recall notice seriously. Frankly, I wasn't even aware as a consumer that the all-weather was specifically targeted here until I, as a member of this committee, know that. Doesn't that tell you that we have a major gap between the way the system ought to work and the way it's actually working?
I would admit that there is a disconnect sometimes between whether people get the information and whether they take it seriously and how it's disseminated. I think that's an issue. I agree with that.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Watson.
Secretary LaHood, congratulations. I've enjoyed your straightforward responses.
Thank you.
And, no, that's a serious commendation. In response to consumer complaints that have come in as early as 2003, NHTSA launched the first of 8 separate investigations into sudden unintended acceleration, and 3 of these investigations concluded that it was the floor mat. And I had the people from Toyota in my office yesterday, and they showed me the floor mat and so on and so forth. Easy to fix. Just shorten the floor mat and so on. What I'm hearing through the media, it's really in the computer system. Can you tell me what you have learned that might be helpful to us that we can relate to our constituents who have Toyotas?
We are going to do a complete review of the electronics to determine if that is part of the reason that some of these vehicles have accelerated or decelerated. We've heard from enough members of Congress about this, and we've heard from enough drivers of these vehicles that they think it's an issue, and we're going to look into it. And we're going to look at information that was provided yesterday to the Energy Committee, the Commerce Committee, by people who've done some studies. We're going to look at some studies that Toyota have done, and we're going to talk to experts about this.
Thank you so much for that response, because I do think it bears looking into, and I shared that with the Toyota people when they came. I said, you got to clarify this particular flaw that seems to be very prevalent. I've read that in Mrs. Claybrook's prepared testimony, she stated that NHTSA statute should be changed to add criminal penalties for complaints for companies who knowingly and willfully refuse to initiate a recall to correct safety defects. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, Ms. Watson, I really haven't thought enough about that to render an opinion. I've seen what Joan Claybrook has said about that, and I'd rather not really venture a guess on that at the moment, or an opinion, excuse me.
So if we find it's necessary, would you work on a provision to...
We are, the information that we've requested from Toyota, which is voluminous, is a part of what we're trying to determine whether there should be some civil penalties.
Thank you. And in your testimony, you described the lengthy process that must be undertaken for your agency to order recall. As a result, consumers are offered protection that the fastest when manufacturers voluntarily initiate recalls. While some of the experiences with Toyota have fortunately been voluntary recalls because of pressure applied by NHTSA, do you think the process for NHTSA to order recall could be made more efficient? And I heard you say that, you know, if you had the employees, if the money was there. So you want to elaborate on that?
I think we should always look at efficiencies. I think if there's a better way to do these things, I'm not opposed to doing that. And if people around here think that there's a better way to do it, we're willing to listen to them. But the system as it exists now, I think, has worked pretty well. But I'm not opposed to doing something more efficiently.
It's been reported that there has been some negotiations between Toyota and, I guess, NHTSA on whether or not the recall, the numbers of recalls should be capped and so on. Can you give us more information?
Not on my watch, Ms. Watson. We've taken this work very seriously, and we do what we think is the best interest of the people that own these automobiles, particularly as it relates to safety.
Well, I wish you well.
Thank
This is
you.
a turbulent time for your agency. I understand that. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Congressman Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know it's been a long day, Mr. Secretary, and I didn't have the privilege of serving with you here in the House, but I'm so glad you are where you are. And I want to thank you for one of the first things you did as our new Secretary of Transportation was sign the full funding grant agreement for Rail to Dulles. Very important project. Thank you so much for your leadership and your support on that. I'm going to ask you a series of questions that are in the category of what do we know and when do we know it, and I understand that most of those answers are probably going to precede your tenure. So I'm asking you to the best of your knowledge, given your current position, what do we know and when do we know it? To the best of your knowledge, Mr. Secretary, when did we first learn, we the federal government, your agency, NHTSA, first learned there was a problem that merited further examination with respect to the acceleration of Toyota vehicles?
Well, I'll get you the exact year, but it was a few years ago. I'll just, you know, for the record, I want to be accurate about these things. You know, I just don't want to speculate. I could pour over my papers here and get you the answer, but I don't want to waste your time. It's better for me to just do it for the record.
That's fine. Mr. Secretary, do you know how many wrongful death lawsuits have been filed with respect to the accelerator problem?
I do not, but I'll find out.
And when they were first filed, that would be very
Okay.
helpful. In the predecessor administration, NHTSA officials flew to Tokyo to meet with Toyota about this problem. Is that not correct?
That was under my watch.
That was under your watch.
Yes, it was. That occurred last year.
And can you describe for us the nature of those conversations?
It was a very, very frank conversation about safety matters that we felt they needed to address. And they began to address them after that meeting occurred. I also had a telephone conversation personally with Mr. Toyota and talked to him about the seriousness of the matter that we were addressing.
And did you find, could you characterize a little bit Toyota's reaction to the seriousness with...
I think they realized that it was a serious situation and that we were not going to countenance any kind of delay in really addressing it.
And do you feel that the company, from your perch, has in fact responded in a timely and effective...
After our visit to Japan and after my phone call with Mr. Toyota, yes.
One of the criticisms one has heard from consumers was that they were in fact lodging complaints with the company, and were kind of being dismissed. And in retrospect, do you believe Toyota could have or should have maybe taken those early warning consumer complaints more seriously? And part two, might it have made a difference in terms of where we are today?
I'd really only be speculating on that. I just, I can only tell you about our involvement, and I think that maybe is a better question for Mr. Toyota.
NHTSA falls in your domain.
Yes.
And as you have said multiple times in this hearing, safety is our #1 priority.
Yes.
Presumably the SOPs, the standard operating procedures for NHTSA, are that alarm bells go off when we learn about, even anecdotally, the acceleration, the involuntary acceleration of a vehicle, let alone anecdotal information that would suggest people have actually lost their lives because of it. We have to certainly at least look into it.
Absolutely.
What grades would you give NHTSA in the past in responding with alacrity to those anecdotal reports, and what have we learned moving forward in the future to improve our performance?
Under my watch, we've taken all of these things very seriously. We really have.
And the previous watch?
Pardon me?
And the previous watch?
Well, I mean, I'll get back to you on the record on that. I mean, look, some things have taken place that maybe should have been done more expeditiously.
Gentleman's time is expired.
I thank the Chair, and I thank the Secretary.
Thank you very much. I now yield to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Chow.
Mr. Secretary, actually, I don't have any questions. Just to have a statement.
Okay.
And just to sincerely thank you for everything you have done for Louisiana, especially for the 2nd District. I know that you've worked very hard in your capacity as Secretary to address all of the transportation issues of the country. But on behalf of my constituents, I just want to thank you for your visit and thank you for everything that you've done for us. And that's all I really have, because I'm pretty sure you've been under hours of questioning already. So
thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary, you don't get that too much around here.
I appreciate it.
I want you to know.
I appreciate it when I hear it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now yield to the gentlewoman from New York, Congresswoman Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first would like to welcome my colleague and very good friend and thank him for his public service in the House of Representatives and now at Transportation. I'd just like to ask a broad question, and how did we get to this place? Toyota had a good reputation. Your department has a good reputation. Yet the field technical reports from the company in Europe show that they knew about this problem and were reporting that there were problems a year ago. Why didn't they bring this to your attention? I'm just saying, reading from the field, I'm reading from the field report. This is an internal document from Toyota. This brings the number of reported cases in the FTR to 38. The customer has stated about this sticky deal and the problem with the acceleration. And so they knew about it in Europe, and yet why is the communication did not work to get to you that this was a problem, to get to American dealers that this was a problem? Can you give an overall assessment of what went wrong and therefore give us a guide to what we need to do in the future for the safety of American citizens and all citizens?
My assessment of this, Mrs. Maloney, is this. Two things, really. I think the business model that Toyota has used, where they have some really, really good, professional, capable people in North America running the company, without the kind of opportunity for decision-making. So then decisions are made in Japan. And I think the second part of it is, well, first of all, I don't know if that business model, I think it's failed them in this instance. And I think the other part of it is, some people in Toyota, and I've said this before, this is not anything new, became a little safety deaf.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, how did the business model fail? They weren't communicating?
No, it's not that they, it's the information was being passed, but then the decisions that I think and the outcomes that people wanted in North America weren't always complied with.
Well, getting back to the sudden acceleration events, you testified that consumers, if they feel they have the problem, they go to their dealer and they correct it. And how do you know that it's been corrected, and how do you know that was the problem? Did you do any independent analysis, or did anyone do any independent analysis of the problem and how to fix it? And how does the consumer know once it has gone back to the company to be corrected that it is in fact corrected?
Well, we as a part of our investigations, we asked the companies to fix the problem and present that information to us. And again, we don't sign on the dotted line and say, you know, we agree or disagree, but if they believe, based on all the excuse me, all the information we've presented them, that they think this is the fix, then that process gets carried over to the customer. And in, I think, many instances, the fix has worked.
Well, later on there'll be a witness who was a former employee of your department or of transportation, and she testifies that, from reading her testimony, that the NHTSA administrators did not adequately investigate the many problems. Now, this was before you took the helm. So the staff has literally shown us, in preparing for this hearing, that there were literally thousands of complaints of sudden unintended acceleration, yet it doesn't appear that any meaningful action was taken until the Saylor family crashed. And my question is, why did it take so long? Again, we're talking about complaints that by some reports started coming in 2004.
Well, we did work with Toyota on a fix on the floor mat, and they put out a recall so that those floor mats could be removed. There's a recall on the sticky pedal, and those are up on the website, and if people take their cars in, Toyota will fix those. And you know, people have to be made aware of it, either by notice or looking on the website or by concern or media reports or whatever. And not everyone has taken their car back, but we encourage people, if you're having a problem with your car, take it to your Toyota dealer.
And since safety is our #1 concern, as you so properly stated from your agency, have you considered asking your Inspector General to audit or examine the prior investigations to determine if they were sufficiently robust? The staff reported to us that many of the investigations were very short, they weren't detailed, that wasn't a thorough investigation.
Well, I have not asked the Inspector General to do that. He's been asked by members of Congress to do some investigations, but not specifically on that issue.
Well, my time has expired. Thank you very much
Thank
for your
you.
testimony and your service.
Thank the gentlewoman from New York. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. You certainly have gotten into a lot of issues in your one-year tenure thus far. Let me ask you, can you speak to the level of cooperation between Japan's counterpart of NHTSA and NHTSA? Is their safety agency open and forthcoming, in your opinion, or does it suffer from the same kind of cloaked and opaque character of that country's Ministry of Trade? Are they working with you and sharing data on this recall issue?
I think in some instances, yes.
So you're saying they've been cooperative in your tenure?
During my tenure, they've been cooperative.
Uh-huh.
In some instances, they have.
But information regarding this acceleration pattern obviously wasn't shared from by their ministry, if they knew about it in Japan, versus our country. Our country, according to the data we've gotten from the Energy and Commerce Committee, first got a timeline in March 2004 that on the Camry, Solara, and Lexus 300 models that NHTSA found no pattern. And then there seems to be a gap between 2004 and 2007 in our country. But in 2007 March, NHTSA opened an investigation on the Lexus ES350 in which NHTSA then found entrapment of the accelerator pedal by floor mat as the sole cause of what happened. And then through 2007, 2008, there were more and more Toyota vehicles until the point in January when Toyota suspended sales of 8 different models. And my question is, when all this was occurring in our country, was Japan's ministry sharing information with you about recalls prior to your tenure?
Yeah, I'll have to check, Ms. Capter, and put it on the record and get back to you on that. I don't know the answer to that.
One of the pieces of data I would like to place up on the boards here is the trade deficit the United States has amassed with Japan over the last 24 years in the area of automotive manufacturing, autos and auto parts. And one of the reasons that Toyota and some of the other companies have been able to gain a beachhead in global auto markets is that it operates from a very tightly protected home market. Even while it's the second largest marketplace in the world. There is a chart that shows the trade deficits our country has amassed with Japan totaling over $1 trillion, which translates into lost jobs in this country. Less than 3% of Japan's marketplace is open to cars from anywhere else in the world. They didn't even take Yugos, and they certainly don't take our auto parts in any appreciable number. Yet we've welcomed their cars here. Our dealers sell their cars that doesn't occur in that country. Imagine the second largest marketplace in the world having less than 3% of their cars from any place else other than Japan, while our market, over half the cars come from elsewhere or from transplants here. And one of my questions of Mr. Toyota, and I have a hunch he's listening, is does this sort of predicament that the company now faces result from a rather attitude of market superiority resulting from the false confidence of a closed home market? In other words, you can afford to ignore some of what is happening because of this false confidence that comes from that kind of a very imbalanced situation. And I'm quite concerned about this. I have been for a long, long time. And my question to you, and I would appreciate for the record going back and seeing what kind of cooperation Japan's counterpart agency actually had with NHTSA. Were there sudden acceleration difficulties inside of Japan, to your knowledge, during this period?
I'll get you that for the record.
Because I think that's really important. Whether it's Canada, United States, what's happening inside Japan's market versus what's happening inside our marketplace, the European marketplace. This is a very, very unlevel playing field. And I'm quite concerned about the fact, oh, and I wanted to ask you for one other piece of information for the record. Inside of NHTSA, how many people from March 2004, which appears to be the first year in which some of these complaints started to come to NHTSA, how many people actually were involved in the assessment of what was happening inside of NHTSA? A staff of 10, 20, 50? What were their backgrounds? How long had they worked for NHTSA? And whom had they worked for before coming to NHTSA? Are you able to provide that information for the record?
We'll do the best we can.
From your sense, how many people, is there anybody from NHTSA there now that can tell us how large was the unit that assessed these recalls? How many people are we talking about?
Look, we want to be accurate about our information. We'll get it for the record.
We'll hold the record open for the information. The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Congressman Clay.
Mr. Chairman, my staff has advised me that all of the questions that I wanted to ask have been asked. We have exhausted this issue with this witness, and I have no questions.
Right. Thank you.
No, you.
Thank you very much. According to the record, I think that everyone, did you have an? Everyone had an opportunity.
I would just yield to Mr. Cummings for his question.
Sure. Right.
You said something that really, I'm so glad I had the chance to answer this. Who was safety deaf? You said somebody was safety deaf.
Toyota.
Toyota was safety deaf. In other words, and then you said that there was some kind of disconnect.
Let me go back and tell you what I said.
Yeah, because I want to be clear on that, because Mr. Toyota I'm going to ask him about what you're saying.
Mrs. Maloney asked me to assess what I think went wrong here. And two things. Toyota has an organization called North America Toyota. They have some great people there. They're very professional. They're good people. We work with them. They make recommendations to Japan. The decisions are made in Japan. The reason that our acting administrator went to Japan because he didn't think his message was getting to Japan. So he flew over there and met with the Toyota people and said, look, this is serious. Lives are being lost.
And when was that?
November, December last year.
Okay.
And right after that, they started taking action. So then I get on the phone with Mr. Toyota, and I said, this is a serious matter. This involves safety. It involves lives. So my point is this. Their business model is they have a lot of good people in North America Toyota, but the decisions are made in Japan.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
That it, Mr. Chairman?
No, gentlemen.
Oh,
1 second.
I was going to say, what a joy it's... oh, no, the young lady from California, of course.
Gentlewoman from California, Congressman.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here these many hours. I'm going to try and be quick and to the point. And I want to talk about the black boxes. If 80% of the cars already have black boxes and they help piece together what happens during the last 5 seconds of an accident, why not make them mandatory in all cars?
Well, it's a good point, and it's been raised here earlier, and we're going to look at that. We really are. It's a good point, and if it's a way for us to really measure what happens, it's something we're going to look at.
Now, as I understand it, you can read the black boxes from some of our domestic manufacturers, but you cannot read the black boxes from Toyota because they're encrypted.
That's correct.
So, shouldn't we require that all black boxes be readable by NHTSA in order to be able to, so you would support that?
Yes.
All right. Have you had a chance to look at Joan Claybrook's EDR recommendations? And if so, would you provide written responses?
You mean her testimony here?
Yes.
I have not read her testimony.
She also suggests that your office needs about $100 million more in terms of support. Would you support that recommendation?
We're very grateful to the President included 66 new positions in our budget for 11.
How many software engineers do you have working within the department?
Software engineers, I'd have to get. We have 100, between 125 and 130 engineers. I'll get you the figure on the software.
All right, and you'll provide it to the committee in a written
course.
response. Because what I've been told is while you do have many engineers, you don't have software engineers.
We have electrical engineers. I know that was a point that people were a little confused about. But
and if this has already been asked, I apologize. But it appears that the chip you need in the computer system in these vehicles to have a brake override is really the solution. Do you concur?
Well, Mr. Lenz said yesterday at the Energy and Commerce Committee that they were installing brake override in many of their vehicles.
I guess my question to you is, irrespective of what Toyota is doing, would you look at it to determine whether or not the requirement that the brake override be actually implemented and installed in more vehicles than Toyota's?
We'll be happy to look at it.
And you'll let the committee know as well?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll give you back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me thank the Secretary for his time. And
what a joy, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're now going to have a 10-minute recess, and then we will come back with the second panel. We're going to have a 10-minute recess, and we come forward with the second panel.
Oh, did I not?